Okay.
I'm using an iPad, but I'm not. I've unmuted.
Morning, old side.
Yeah.
Morning.
That's why what?
Morning.
That's what life is all about.
I said to you, Mark. Did you? Yeah. What did you say to me? No, Debbie. I said no, Mark.
Yeah, it's probably.
Yep, he's frozen again.
Okay, am I back?
Yes.
Yeah.
My computer doesn't like it when I go into other windows. It gets very upset. It's a bit old.
You're what
that
we call you're what we call in the YouTube world laggy.
Yes, indeed.
If you know what that means.
Yes, I do.
Good.
So, but it seems to be a Zoom thing as well. It gets upset when you go to another window. But also my internet's slow because everyone's on it, and Virgin came to install it and got the wrong address. So we're still waiting for them. That's going to be a story, and a half, no doubt. Okay, let's just share this.
Got the wrong address. Remember last week where they're still waiting for them?
The annoying thing is, every time I told them, "Are you sure you've got the right address?" Yes, don't worry. I said it's not flat A, it's number 20A. Yes, we've got it. And I finally spoke to a guy yesterday. He's like, we've got the wrong address. I said, I know, I told you that.
Wait.
Anyway, never mind. Right, okay. Just sharing this on Facebook. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay, we're about to hopefully, all being well, share the synopsis of this week's Edge. So we're starting a new book this week, which we will be happy to be doing back in Shaw. Here we go. Okay, I'm not muting anyone, but if you feel you're being noisy, please mute yourself. Okay, Iris, here you go. Off you go.
Hang on. Okay. On the first of Shavat, 37 days before his passing, Moses begins his repetition of the Torah to the assembled children of Israel, reviewing the events that occurred and the laws that were given in the course of their 40-year journey from Egypt to Sinai to the Promised Land, rebuking the people for their failings and iniquities, and enjoining them to keep the Torah and observe its commandments in the land that God is giving them as an eternal heritage, into which they shall cross after his death. Moses recalls his appointment of judges and magistrates to ease his burden of meting out justice to the people and teaching them the word of God. The journey from Sinai through the great and fearsome desert, the sending of the spies, and the people's subsequent spurning of the promised land, so that God decreed the entire generation of the Exodus would die out in the desert. Also against me, says Moses, was God angry for your sake, saying, you too shall not go in there.
Right, there's more.
Moses also recounts some more recent events. The refusal of the nations of Moab and Ammon to allow the Israelites to pass through their countries, the wars against the Amorite kings, Sihon and Og, and the settlement of their lands by the tribes of Reuben and Gad and part of the tribe of Manasseh, and Moses' message to his successor, Joshua, who will take the people into the land and lead them in the battles for its conquest. Fear them not, for the Lord your God, he shall fight for you.
Okay, thank you. If somebody asked you to name a Jewish profession, what would you say, probably?
Doctors, my mum said.
Doctors?
Rabbi.
Rabbis, thank you for that, yeah.
Busy rabbis.
Accountants.
Lawyers. Right, okay. So today we're going to talk about lawyers. Why are we so obsessed with law in Judaism? And it could be that besides for being a good way to make money or give nachas to your grandparents, that one reason a lot of us go into law might well be because of our Torah underpinnings. It's funny. I studied IT at Birmingham University, software engineering, in 1995 to 98, but I actually applied to Cambridge for law when I was in sixth form. And I don't know who advised me. I didn't know anything about law. I'd read very little about it. I just thought it sounded interesting. I don't know if I wanted to be a lawyer. I don't think I did want to be a lawyer. I still don't know why I applied for that. because my passion was computing. But it's funny. It's one of those things in a Jewish school. I guess people kind of just gravitate towards law and medicine. You need more of a scientific background. You can't just do it. But law and accountancy, people gravitate towards. It's very boring and predictable. Right. Anyone know the joke? Everyone know the joke about the lawyers and the heaven and the hell?
No.
So they were having a problem. No offense to any lawyers here. So they were having a problem in heaven. I don't think hell exists in Judaism in the same way. But anyway, let's say it does in the cartoon way. So they're having a problem that the people in hell are not very nice and they're like throwing rocks at the people in heaven. So the Almighty summons the devil and says, listen, mate, this is not on. I'm going to do what Mr. Trump's doing, what the Israelis do. I'm going to build a wall. I'm going to build a very high wall between our two spaces. And being that you guys are the ones causing all the trouble, I'm going to send you the bill for it. So the devil says to him, I'm not paying. The Almighty says, yes, you are. It's your responsibility. It's your delinquents. He says, I'm not paying. I'm not paying you a penny. God says, yes, you are. He says, and if you don't pay, I'll sue you. He says, oh, yeah? Where would you find a lawyer?
That's right.
Right? For those who don't get it, the implication all the lawyers go to hell. Anyway, right. Yes. So let's have a look at law and justice and how central it is. So Moses, of course, was the lawgiver. So let's have a look. Okay. Source number 2. This is a quote from this week's Sedra. Those of you who are very eagle-eyed will notice that it's, for some reason, right justified. It thinks it's Hebrew. So you see it's doing a right rather than left. Okay, who would like to read number 2? This is from this week's Sedra. Any volunteers?
Shall I read what?
Sure, Brenda. Right.
Oh, yeah, wait a minute. I think there's some of the thing hasn't. Oh, no, that's okay. And I charge you, your judges at that time, hear the disputes between your people and judge fairly, whether the case is between 2 Israelites or between an Israelite and a foreigner residing among you. Do not show particularly in what? Partiality in judging here, both small and great alike. Do not be afraid of anyone, for judgment belongs to God. Bring me any case too hard for you, and I will hear it.
Okay, let's give this context. The book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, is often known as Mishneh Torah, which means a restatement of Torah. It's a summary of the first 4 books. Right? And Moshe starts off by talking about their history in the desert and the leaders that were appointed, heads of thousands, hundreds, 50s, and 10s. And then he says this bit about justice and judgment. So at the very outset of a summary of our history and our destiny, one of the first things that's mentioned is the administration of justice. Right? And we see it later on as well. This very famous quote. Who would like to read this one, number 3? Any volunteers?
I'll do it. I'll do it then.
Mark?
My justice shall you pursue, that you may thrive and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving to you. It's given you. So someone's at the phone. Sorry.
Right. So what do you have to do? Right. So this is from later on the same chapter. So how do you thrive? How do you occupy the land? It's a loaded word that God is giving you through pursuing justice. And whenever you have a double word in Hebrew, it comes to give certainty. So, for example, we find sometimes the Torah says, Yadoa Teda, you should surely know. Not just know, but you should really know. So you shouldn't just pursue justice, but you should really tenaciously pursue the ultimate justice. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Right? Pursue justice. Very important principle. Tzedek means, there are 2 words we find regularly. Tzedek, which means righteousness or justice. And of course, what's the other word for justice? Anyone? Mishpat. Right, mishpat, like mishpatim or shoftim, judges. So mishpat is judgment. Tzedek is justice. Interesting, because tzedek also means righteousness, but we find it used quite a lot interchangeably. If you're interested in numbers, the root for justice, shofet or shafat, occurs 48 times in the book of Deuteronomy, and tzedek appears 18 times. That's quite a lot of times. So Jewish professions are doctors, lawyers, accountants, and rabbis. What would you say are Jewish values if you asked to describe to someone values of Judaism?
Charity.
Charity.
Justice.
Justice, right. So education. So justice is the one I wanted to hear for now, right? So people would often say justice. I mean, does not every culture and society should have in theory a legal system, a system of justice? But in Judaism, it's very fundamental. Access to justice and so on. We just saw the quote that said you should treat everyone equally in justice. Let's see what a very famous Jew had to say about it. Who's feeling intelligent today? Michael, would you like to read Albert Einstein?
No, I'm okay.
No? Okay.
Yeah.
Julian.
Will I read?
Sure.
The pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, an almost fanatical love of justice, and the desire for personal independence. These are the features of the Jewish tradition, which make me thank my lucky stars that I belong to it.
Right. It's wonderful. He doesn't say thank God. Yeah. So, okay, what's a sort of, I don't know if Einstein was a particularly religious man, but probably not. But what's his view? You ask about Judaism, a love of justice. He says almost fanatically so. Right. This is probably why you find that we're very good at protesting on other people's behalf. Right. There was this protest in Hampstead Garden suburb, Black Lives Matter protests, and Jewish people went out to protest there. It's just funny because you don't imagine most people in Hampstead Garden suburb going out on the streets very much to protest. In America, Jews are always at the head of social action and social justice, sometimes in conflict with Jewish values. So, for example, the anti-circumcision movement was started by someone Jewish, right? But we know that throughout history, a lot of times, campaigners for freedom and civil rights, certainly in social justice, was often very close, particularly usually to liberal Jews. So Einstein touches on it there. That's what Einstein has to say, right? No fool, obviously. Somebody once asked Lady Cosgrove, who is a judge in Scotland, very high up, member of the Jewish community, why she chose law. And she said, what do you mean? Because it says in the Torah, you have to pursue justice. Interesting quote from Alan Dershowitz. Do you know who the first lawyer in the Bible was? Anyone know? Who was the first lawyer in the Bible?
Wasn't Korach, was it?
I'll give you a clue. It was a defense attorney, defense lawyer.
Abraham.
Abraham, thank you. When he stood up for Sodom and Gomorrah, and he argued their case. Right? He was prepared to get God angry in order to defend Sodom and Gomorrah. You know the story, right? Abram stood up to God and said, how can you destroy these people? Right? And what did he actually say to God? He said, you are the judge of all the earth. How can you destroy these people? He was acting like a lawyer, basically. There are many episodes, interestingly, if you want to talk, we talk a lot about prophets and kings and priests, but actually, if you imagine, maybe replace the word lawyer with advocate, there are many times Moshe was an advocate for his people. Many prophets were advocates for their people, right? So the Jewish image of somebody as the advocate sticking up for the underprivileged is quite something. In America, there are many Jewish justices. In Britain also, at least 3 Lord Chief Justices in the last 25 years have been Jewish. No, 2, sorry. Lord Justice Taylor and Lord Justice Wolfe. In Germany, before the war, we were 0.7% of the population, but we represented 16.6% of the legal profession, including judges. Didn't help us in the camps, but okay. Very often, we find God himself is accused. Right? Moshe says to God, how can you do this? It's not right. The famous story of God on trial. Anyone see that TV program? God on Trial a few years ago? Anyone know the story?
No.
So
Primo Levi.
I saw it attributed to Elie Wiesel, but it might well have been written by Primo Levi. There's a machlokes whether it happened or not. But supposedly Elie Wiesel said it did happen. That there were a group of them in Auschwitz, and some of them were Rabbonim and Dayanim, and they said they called Hashem to a din Torah, right, to a trial on the basis that he abandoned his people, and they had.
Rabbi.
Yes.
My mum says something because her mic's not working. Moses' father-in-law, Yitro.
Right, so he was the one that set up. He's the one that advised Moshe to set up a system of justice with different levels of court. So if you ask the question, where's the first time we find a proper structure of a justice system, a legal system, I would agree with you. In fact, we know that until then, Moshe used to do everything himself. And Yitro said, you can't, it's too much for you. You need a hierarchy. So you are quite right. The first hierarchy certainly was set up with Yitro's advice. But being an advocate goes back earlier than that. It goes back to the times of Avraham. We find that often God himself has the finger poked to him. Avram also. Avram says to God, how can you destroy these people? It goes against your own rules. Right? How can you talk to Hashem like that? But Avram does. Right?
And we have the story of
right, yes. So the story of God on trial is
Yeah.
a group of prisoners in Auschwitz decided that they'd been, quite understandably, they'd been abandoned by Hashem, and they decided to put him on trial, as you would at a Beis Din. So there were people appointed to represent the prosecution and the defense. The prosecution, came along and said, you promised in the covenant. I don't remember exactly, but you made a covenant with your people, and you've broken the covenant because they're being destroyed, and this and that. And the defense said, but Hashem warned you that, I don't know exactly what they quoted, but places, I guess, where he said that he might abandon them if they do this or do that. And anyway, at the end, the judges retired to consider the verdict, and they found the Almighty guilty of abandonment in their Din Torah. So the way I saw it in the TV version was they said, well, what do we do now? One of them said, we better pray pretty hard. The way I heard the story told was that one of them said, what do we do now? And the other said, we have to go down Mincha before it's too late. In other words, that their faith and their observance is not in conflict with the fact that they're upset with Hashem. Right? They didn't decide that he didn't exist. They decided that he let them down. So we find throughout history episodes where that was even our relationship with God himself. Let's have a look at a couple from the prophets. No, not the prophets. Sorry. 1 second. Before we do that, let's talk about something else. Let's talk about the role of law in Judaism, right? Law is central to Judaism. To be a religious Jew is to follow Jewish law, right? It's not enough to say I'm a cardiac Jew, I'm a Jew in my heart. Some of the rabbis tell jokes. That's why everyone gets heart problems, because it's all in the heart. People say, I'm a Jew in my heart, Rabbi, I feel Jewish. Don't eat kosher, but I feel Jewish, right? We know that Judaism in reality is a faith of law, abide, whatever the noun is, abiding by the law, right? That's what Judaism is. The law is central to Judaism. What was given on Mount Sinai? The Torah, the law, the laws. And we find an interesting thing also, which is, of course, that what is our job? Say the clergy, the rabbis, but in general, what is our job? Our job, of course, is to interpret Jewish law. We know that Jewish law is not just biblical, right? The classic example, when it says an eye for an eye in the Bible, and the commentaries, the rabbis come along and say, it doesn't mean an eye for an eye, it means the value of an eye, right? Or the Torah says you can't cook on Shabbat, and from that, we don't learn that you can't light a fire on Shabbat, but you can light one before Shabbat, right? We always...
when you're talking about the laws, is that the mitzvah? The
basically. Yeah. So, I mean, we've got the 10 Commandments, but the concept, if you ask people what is central to Judaism, Torah means instruction. It's a rule. It's a manual. It's a rule book. Okay. If you do a survey of, 3 different Jewish people, they all have different levels of observance, but at the heart of Judaism is observance of the law. Now, people may disagree on how far they take that, but the concept, there are laws that we have to obey, kashrut laws and Shabbat laws and interpersonal laws and laws of how we treat animals and laws of how we keep the festivals and laws of Pesach and laws of honesty and business dealings and laws of things like circumcision and weddings, how we do weddings. And there's all kinds of laws and rules. We're a religion of rules, right? Islam is very similar. Christianity is very different, ironically. We are a way of life, a code of conduct. So in Judaism, having a code, having a set of laws is very important. First of all, because the Torah itself, which includes the 613 mitzvot, right? So the Torah tells us fundamental laws we know. It says in the Shema, put something on your doorpost. It doesn't give you the details, right? We know from that we learn mezuzah or tefillin, we learn. But the Torah tells us certain things. But of course, many things that we do, we have rabbinic law. So for example, why do we not eat milk and meat? Because the Torah says don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. Why do we wait 3 hours? Because we have rabbinic law that says that if you can't cook them together, you shouldn't eat them together either. If you can't eat them together, you should wait till you've digested your meat before you eat milk. That's rabbinic in origin, right? It says that you can't light a fire on Shabbat. It doesn't say that you can't pick up a matchstick and fiddle with it. The rabbis came along and said, if you can't light a fire, why should you be allowed to even pick up a match? It's muktzah. You can't use it on Shabbos. In fact, if you pick it up, you might be tempted to use it. So we're going to make a rule. You can't touch things on Shabbat that have no use. You can't touch a pen. You can't touch a box of matches. You can't touch a lighter. You can't touch your phone because it has no use. That's rabbinic laws. But the interesting thing is, of course, that we have a clear delineation of what is Torah law, which is clearly written, the written law, and what is rabbinic law, which is the oral law, which interprets the written law. It goes further than that. Let's have a look at the experience of Sinai. This is Moshe recalling what took place at Sinai. Right, who would like to read? Who hasn't read yet?
I'll read, Rabbi.
Okay, Jeff, off you go.
The Lord spoke those words, those and no more, to your whole congregation at the mountain, with a mighty voice out of the fire and the dense clouds. He inscribed them on 2 tablets of stone, which he gave to me.
Right. I think I've just given the wrong quote. Yes, I have. Sorry. Right. I meant to give a quote from the book of Exodus, but anyway, never mind. What does it say here? It says, the Hebrew says, Es adrim ha'ele, these words, and the commentaries say, these words and no more. In other words, there was a very clear limit to what was given in the Torah on Mount Sinai, and that is the Torah as we have it, the written Torah. The rest, as they say, is commentary. The rest is down to us in every generation to interpret the oral law. When it talks about the original giving of the Torah, use a phrase in Hebrew. This is what I meant to put up. Kol gadol, a loud voice, a booming voice. Velo yosaf, which did not continue, did not echo. So they interpret that in different ways. Some interpret that God spoke to us at Sinai, gave us the Torah, and then handed it over to us to deal with it, to interpret it, right? We know the Torah is not in heaven, the Torah is on earth. We are charged with interpreting the Torah and applying it to every generation. A voice which ceased. What does it mean it ceased? Why did the voice cease? The voice stopped at Sinai, meaning you heard from God, I now hand it over to you. And the idea that the oral Torah, the interpretation of Torah, the application of every generation is down to us is very fundamental. There's a very famous story from the Talmud, which we think we've learned before. It's quite a long one. Who would like to read a nice long source? Who's feeling ambitious? Anyone? Who's a good storyteller?
I'll do it if you like again.
Go on, Iris. Go on. You get all the long readings. Go on.
Well, the sages taught on that day when they discussed this matter, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion. But the rabbis did not accept his explanations.
Okay, I can't remember. Just by the way, it was a debate about some kind of oven, whether it cooked in one way or another way. It was a very technical debate. They were having a halachic technical debate. Rabbi Eliezer was saying like everything possible to try to prove his point, and nobody accepted it. Right, let's see what happens next.
After failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, this carob tree will prove it. The carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits, and some say 400 cubits.
Right, just pause for a second, sorry. 100 cubits, by the way, is about 50 meters. 400 cubits is about 200 meters. Does that prove anything? If trees start moving around, does that prove I'm right? Let's see.
The rabbis said to him, one does not cite halakhic proof from the carob tree. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the stream will prove it. The water in the stream turned backward and began flowing in the opposite direction. They said to him, one does not cite halakhic proof from a stream. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of the study hall will prove it. The walls of the study hall leaned inward and began to fall. Rabbi Yehoshua scolded the walls and said to them, if Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of halakha, what is the nature of your involvement in this dispute? The Gemara relates, the walls did not fall because of the deference due to Rabbi Yehoshua, but they did not straighten because of the deference due to Rabbi Eliezer, and they still remain leaning.
Maybe that's how the Tower of Pisa got to lean. Okay, there's more.
Oh, sorry. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, If the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. A divine voice emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer? As the halakha is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses an opinion. Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and said, it is written, it is not in heaven. The Gemara asks, what is the relevance of the phrase, it is not in heaven, in this context? Rabbi Yirmiyah says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice, as you already wrote at Sinai in the Torah, after a majority to incline.
It's a strange phrase. It means you follow the majority. So when it comes to matters of law, we follow a majority opinion.
Since the majority of rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, the halakha is not ruled in accordance with his opinion. The Gemara relates, years after, Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah the prophet and said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at that time when Rabbi Yehoshua issued his declaration? Elijah said to him, the Holy One, blessed be he, smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me.
Right, so this is a nice fable, but it's one that illustrates a point, right? The Gemara tells this story to illustrate a very important point. Even if God himself says you should listen to so-and-so, you say to God, you're not part of this discussion. You gave us the Torah. You told us in your Torah that the Torah is not in heaven. That means that we down here have to interpret it. So you have no business interfering in our interpretation of Torah. Right, it's pretty radical. So, right, and we see Hashem was very happy that this is an example, by the way, of a machlokes, what we call an argument l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. Right, this whole argument, they're not arguing because they don't like each other. It's a dispute, it's a discussion of halacha, right? And it illustrates a very important point that even if God himself booms from heaven that so-and-so is right, it doesn't mean anything unless they are right. If they're right because they're right according to legal principles, that's fine. But otherwise, say to God, mind your own business, right? Which is pretty rude, basically. But we see this is what the law is. So a few things. First of all, other religions have, all kinds of revelations. Our revelation at Sinai was all about law. Like God revealed himself to us in the form of a book of law. In other cultures, God was power and strength, or God of war, the God of love, or the Greek gods. In Judaism, he was the God of law and order. The very first thing he did was gave us a set of rules. Right? In the natural world, you have scientific law. In the human world, you have moral law. But law, following rules, right? Being law-abiding, basically. Point number one. So when you talk about the revelation at Mount Sinai, it's a revelation of law. Number two, we interpret law. God said, my voice stops here, meaning from now on, you guys have to take over. And even if you get a voice from heaven, it's just a test. So if you get a voice from heaven saying, you should follow the Sephardim and not the Ashkenazim, you should only do that if it makes legal sense. We don't decide things. There's one exception that comes to mind, which is Korach, obviously, which is if your opponent gets struck by, swallowed up by the earth, then you probably won the case on default, right? But that's quite unusual. And the third thing is, one second. Oh yeah, sorry. So yeah, this is the idea of law. Let's just see what the Talmud says about judges and about the power of upholding the law in terms of our world. So who hasn't read for a while? Any volunteers? Pam, over to you.
Okay. Rav here, Bar Rav from Difti, taught them a baraita with regard to the verse. And it was the next day, and Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood over Moses from the morning until the evening. Does it mean that Moses would sit and judge all day long? If so, when was his Torah study accomplished? Rather, surely the verse is coming to tell you, any judge who judges a true judgment truthfully, even if he sits in judgment only 1 hour, the verse ascribes to him as if he became a partner to the Holy One, blessed be, in the act of creation, as by means of a true judgment he upholds the world.
So it's curious this, because usually if you want to allude to creation, you say evening and morning, because that's how the order of creation was. But we're saying basically, does it mean Moshe stood there all day long? No. When did he have time to do other things? It means that he stood from morning to evening, meaning the very world, each day stands on justice. That's what the Miri says. Right? So how do you become a partner in creation? There's a few ways. Right? Having children is one. Another way is by upholding justice, because the world is built on justice. It's a pillar of the world. It's the law was given at Sinai to us as a nation. So justice is central to Jewish what do we call it? Experience. Right. So it's pretty important. So from this, you could say everyone should become a judge. Very important job. Let's see what the prophet said. Isaiah 51. Michael, you want to read this? It's a short one. No? Okay, I'll read it. Listen to me, you who know justice, the people in whose heart is my law. Do not fear the reproach of men, nor be afraid of their insults. Right? So Isaiah says to the people, what defines you as people? Number one, you know justice. And number two, you have the law of the Lord in your heart. Right? That's how Isaiah defines the Jewish people. He says, you are people who have the law in your heart and who know justice. Now, justice, of course, doesn't just mean going to court, right? You've got social justice, moral justice, right? You know, the kind of thing that motivates a person to go and bat for somebody who's underprivileged in society. Social justice might come under the heading of justice as well. All right. Let's see what Jeremiah says. Anyone else want to read? Mark, do you want to read again?
Yeah, I'll do this one.
Here we go.
Right. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people.
So again, what does Jeremiah say about us? What's the covenant? It's to put his law within us and write it on our hearts. Again, it's a reference to the law. Josephus, I've quoted this before. Josephus, right, the historian who wrote at Roman times, famously, he was Jewish. Yeah, he wrote as follows: should any one of us be asked about our laws, he will repeat them as readily as his own name. Right? We said this when we talked about education. Nowadays, you take it for granted, well, maybe not nowadays, but before lockdown, that every kid in school learns certain basic things about British history, English, maths. If you go back 2,000 years, you didn't have a wide-scale education. Right? School, as we know it, started what, in Victorian times? I don't know. But we saw, if you remember in the Talmud, they said that they started schools already 1,800 years ago, that they would have people teach other people's children. That was an amazingly radical idea. So Josephus said, every Jew knows. Now, unfortunately, halavai, this would be true now of every Jewish child nowadays, but it should be that every child knows basic Judaism. If you would stop them and say, tell me about being a Jew, they'd say you have the kosher laws and the Shabbat laws and the laws of how to honor your parents, and they would know all the laws. They'd be a lawyer, effectively. They'd be learned in the law, right? To be a good Jew is to know the law, right? We're learning Hilchot Shabbat. It's quite complicated. Right? Even us rabbis, there's lots of halachas we don't know, because it's like a lawyer will have laws that he's not yet come across, or she, right? It's important to note that the law is a means to an end of coming close to God, following the rules. But nonetheless, central to Judaism is Jewish law, right? So, yes, Judaism is about spirituality and God, but it's also about having a code of conduct which leads, hopefully, to a more just society. Whenever we refer to as the people of the law, the people of the book, the people, as Isaiah says, who have the law in their hearts, or as Jeremiah says, the people who God puts his law into them. So coming back to the question, why are there so many Jewish lawyers? I don't know the reason, but a nice explanation would be because it's such a central thing to Jewish belief and culture, is having a set of rules. It's the most natural thing in the world for a person to say, I like the idea of law and order. I don't know if that's why people go into law, but there we go. Okay, it's slightly shorter today. That's what I've got to offer. So going back to the first source we read, right, one of the first things Moshe tells the people is that he gave the judges the responsibility of hearing lawsuits. Why? Because not saying frivolous litigation, but the idea of a legal process and of justice is fundamental and central to being Jewish and Jewish society. Any questions? We're a little bit early this week. Any thoughts?
Yeah, Rabbi.
Yeah.
If each generation or some generation should re-study, as we study all the time, the Torah,
Yeah.
and we can change it. I feel that there should be a set time for different generations to restudy the Torah and change certain things, not just go along with what it was at the beginning. Do you understand what I mean?
I do understand what you mean. So there's a few things to say on that. Number one, it's like any system built on precedent, right? Once you have precedents, they become very powerful. So, for example, in the United States, you know, the whole abortion issue is based on Roe versus Wade, which is 1977, I think, which set precedents. Once you have a decision that sets precedent, to upset precedent is much harder. I don't understand exactly how it works. Jewish law is based on precedent also. So we will say, for example, we have a ruling of so-and-so that says that so-and-so, unless someone's got a very compelling argument against that, we follow that ruling, whatever that may be. So I'll give you an example, the whole debate over organ donation and about the debate about what is considered death. And some people say brainstem death, and some people say cardiac arrest, and there's a whole discussion, and there's rulings, clear rulings made with consensus by very strong bodies of rabbinic opinion. So I can't come along and just say, I'll give you the classic example. Let's talk about second day Yom Tov, right? Second day Yom Tov is rabbinic. Everyone says, why can't they repeal it? It's so difficult for people. They have to take 2 days off work. So we say all these things like spiritually, you know, you need twice as many days in the diaspora. But at the end of the day, it is purely rabbinic. And the proof of that is that we bury people on second day Yom Tov if we have to. We don't bury them first day Yom Tov. It happened this year because of the pandemic. Right? You probably come across this classic Trivial Pursuit question. How is second day Yom Tov different from first day Yom Tov? You can do Levi's. What are you talking about? No, you can't. You can't drive and stuff. Yes, you can. You are allowed to break Yom Tov in order to effect a burial. Why? Because the Torah says explicitly you shouldn't leave someone overnight. So if it's a choice of leaving someone overnight, which is a Torah mitzvah, or keeping second day Yom Tov, which is rabbinic, then you're allowed to break Yom Tov purely for that. And it happened in the US cemeteries this year. I believe it happened. There were Levi's on Yom Tov. So second day Yom Tov. So people are very quick to say, why do you have to do it? Why can't somebody come along and change it? So let's say hypothetically you wanted to change it, right? So I don't know when second day Yom Tov was enacted. Sometime presumably around the post-temple times. You're going to have a few problems. The biggest problem you're going to have is like anything, right? What happens if you want to change British summertime to make it 2 hours instead of 1 hour, right? The immediate problem you're going to have, you see it with the pandemic, is consensus. If you don't have consensus, then you can't do things, because if you don't have consensus, you lose the people, as it were. So the first problem you have in halacha is you need a consensus of rabbinic opinion of your generation. And then you need everyone to come together and decide together and agree to not to dissent, right? Because it's no good if, I'll give you a very simple example. There was a rabbi, I don't think he's any longer alive, called Emanuel Rachman, who was the rector, I think, of Bar-Ilan University, whatever that role is exactly. And he came up with an idea to solve the problem of agonot being, of course, women who remain in loveless marriages because the husband won't give them a get, and therefore they're not legally, halachically divorced. And he came up with a brilliant idea called Mekach Ta'us. Mekach Ta'ut means basically when you were sold a false bill of goods, right? When somebody sold you something under false pretenses, right? So in the same way that if I go to buy an authentic Rolex and it turns out it's fake, I can claim a refund or go to trading standards, right? So the premise was, when you get married, you have to disclose things, right? The person has to know who they're marrying. You know, you can't just marry someone blind, as it were. You have to know who you're marrying. So the question is, we'll call them Mr. and Mrs. Couple to avoid arguments. So you're going to say to Mrs. Couple, they want a divorce, and Mr. Couple won't give Mrs. Couple a divorce for whatever reasons. So along comes Rabbi Rachman and says, Mrs. Couple, would you have married your husband knowing he's such a horrible man that he would refuse to give a get to his wife and he would persecute her in this way and abuse her? So Mrs. Couple says, no, of course I wouldn't. Says, then in that case, you were missold your marriage, because you married him thinking he's a mensch, and actually he's such a degenerate nice old-fashioned word, then he won't even give you a get. So knowing that, would you have married him? Of course I wouldn't. In that case, said Rabbi Rachman, I annul your marriage because your marriage is made under false pretenses. You didn't know that he was such a unpleasant person. So the idea has a basis in halakha that you can annul a sale if you were missold, your PPI or whatever. So what's the problem? The problem is Rabbi Rachman, I hope I'm quoting this correctly, it's my understanding of the case, was a lone voice, right? What he did not do is to go around the world and speak to all the leading rabbis and say, this is my proposal. Are you prepared to sign on to my proposal? Because if all the chief rabbis agreed to it, then it'll have some teeth. So you ended up with an unfortunate situation that got even worse. Because now you've got an agonah who can't get a get, who can't get divorced. And then you've got someone that Rabbi Rachman has annulled their marriage, but other rabbis don't agree with his ruling. They believe his ruling is flawed. And they'll say she's still married. So she's in a worse situation. Right? So well-meaning attempts to do things without consensus are very problematic. So if you wanted to, for example, to annul the second day Yom Tov, for example, you would have to get a consensus of world rabbinic opinion behind it. Otherwise, it would be a joke. The other problem you have is that a based in or a collective rabbinate it's like anything else, right? Once something goes to the Supreme Court, it can't go back to the district courts or county courts, right? Or not parish courts, whatever, I don't know what, magistrates courts, right? Once something gets escalated, you can't de-escalate it. Same thing in halakha. So something that was decided by the Sanhedrin in times of the Gemara has a very strong force to it. We don't have a Sanhedrin nowadays, 71 judges, all appointed to sit in Jerusalem. If we had a Sanhedrin, they could change.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
My mom's got a question.
Yeah.
No, the thing about Agunot, why can't the rabbi who came up with this still alive?
No, he's not. I don't think he's alive anymore.
Oh, he's not. It's an old time.
No.
Why can't they now get a consensus that is the right thing to do?
I don't know, but my understanding is
That it's the right thing to do.
I don't know all the details, but the point is, right? It'd be like my saying, I'll give you a very simple topical example, and I'll say it very openly, right? Anyone who's on SXK will see there are a lot of people that advertise products that are not kosher supervised, right? You will probably notice it's a frustration of mine because I often comment on it. And I actually was vindicated last night because somebody phoned me and said, I assumed the product was kosher because somebody advertised it, and I just found out it wasn't, and I'm very disturbed because I ate that product. Now, I know that you have to look for kosher supervision, but not everybody knows that. Okay, so to be fair, I do know that to get KLBD supervision has certain minimum standards. It's probably not very practical. If I'm making, I don't know, popcorn at home and I want it to be kosher, I'm not going to get a KLBD license. Okay, so if we were in Liverpool or Cardiff or possibly even Leeds, maybe not Leeds, Birmingham, Nottingham, Leicester, Bristol, Newcastle, anywhere that doesn't have, if you like, a based in, so not Leeds, Manchester, or London, right? Quite honestly, if we were in Cardiff right now, probably, and you were making popcorn at home and you keep a kosher home, and you say, I want people to have my popcorn at the Kiddush, and I only use salt and I have a special machine and everything, Rabbi, you can come and inspect it, right? What we would probably do is I would say to you, let me come and inspect your popcorn making, and if you're happy to agree to certain rules, I'll give you a license, okay? I'll give you a hechsher. I will personally certify your popcorn that you're selling or your ice cream, whatever you're making, on the basis that I inspect it and it's 100% kosher. And the community will buy it. In fact, they did that in Bristol for a while. There was a from Israeli guy that made piti at a bakery. One of the local rabbis gave him supervision, right? Now, the person has to want supervision. Not everyone advertising on SXK wants to be kosher, okay? But I'm just saying, I know for a fact that if I, or any other rabbi in Essex for that matter, gave a personal supervision to something, the next problem would be that, for example, Pam and Julian would say to Stu, there's somebody in Essex, they make the most amazing challahs, they make them at home, Rabbi Wallenberg supervises it, you should get them. And Stu wants to get them, but the KLBD or the SKA, as an established authority, will say, well, we don't know Rabbi Wallenberg, what's his supervision, right? He's one guy, we don't accept it. So I would probably shoot myself in the foot. Now, you might say it doesn't matter because people in Essex would buy it, but it's a very topical issue. There is definitely a case for having some kind of local supervision. But then the problem is it wouldn't be recognized nationally. Right? That's the simple reality. I'm sure there's lots of other examples of that. Right? Conversions.
But
You know?
it'll be okay if it was for the community.
So I think one
In
day
your community, like for Woodford Forest,
okay,
it could be okay.
Right. So we get away with it when it comes to shul stuff, right? All shul stuff is under local supervision. No one says it has to be under KLBD. Right? But I have to tell you also honestly, I don't know of any business that wants to be kosher that's not. Right? So in other words, it's not. If this was Boreham Wood, you have like cottage industries. We know someone that does cake decorating. She's a from lady. She's not under supervision. I would personally eat her food from her home. We didn't allow it in shul because it's not under supervision. I didn't feel it was right. But quite honestly, all her clients buy her food. There's no issue there other than that she can't be used by caterers and things. She probably doesn't want to pay for supervision. But presumably Rabbi Chappell will say to himself, this is not a battle I have to fight because this person at the end of the day keeps a strictly kosher home and they just don't have supervision. There's still a case for supervision, by the way, because one of the reasons for supervision is that as soon as you start selling something, you become what we call in Hebrew nageya, which means you become biased, right? It's a lot to ask from somebody that I'm going to sell my salads from home and I'm also going to be responsible for checking them for bugs, because what happens when I find that there's so many bugs in the lettuce that my business is losing money? At what point will I be tempted to cut corners? So by having supervision, you introduce an independent element, right? It's like any quality control. But putting that to one side, Brenda is right. If you look carefully, a lot of the shuls recently have done food. Chabad has done it. A couple of other people have done it. We've done takeout, whatever. We do the diner. Ultimately, in better times, you can come and do a simple catered thing in our shul very easily, buy stuff in or make it in shul. It's doable. And it works for the community. The businesses that are advertising on SXK, I can tell you, I'm quite happy to say, every single person that advertises on there that is not supervised, I've personally contacted and said, if you ever want to be supervised, come and talk to me. We'll see what we can do. And every single one of them has said, no, thank you. They don't want to be supervised. So the problem is not lack of supervision. The problem is that people don't want to be kosher. Right? Shalom Bakery wants to open on Shabbos and they want to serve non-kosher meat. They're not going to change just because someone says, I'll offer you supervision for £10 a month. That's the reality. Right? And then the bigger discussion is that the punters don't care. Not everyone, but I'm saying there isn't public demand for it. But that would be a classic example. If we would give if someone would give an individual supervision, it's really difficult because if you don't have any standard, any national recognition, right? Second Day Yom Tov is the other classic example. So to change Second Day Yom Tov, you would need a consensus of world rabbinic opinion, right? Good luck getting that. That's all I'll say. That's the problem. When people put their heads together, they can usually solve things. Not always. That's always the problem with these things. I'm trying to think of an example of something that has changed.
Can I ask a question, Rabbi?
Yes.
Well, Mark.
Oh, sorry. I will give an example of something that's changed. The approach to organ donation, right? There's various legal things going on. It's a whole big share in itself.
Oh, yes.
But the approach to live donation has changed. In the 1950s or 60s, if you would have asked a Rav, can I be a kidney donor or a liver donor? No, not a liver. Yeah, liver donor? Can you give? Yeah, you can donate part of your liver, right?
Yes.
I think so. Right? Can I be a kidney donor or a liver donor, living donor? They would have said, no, it's too dangerous. It's too risky. Now that it's become safer, they'll tell you you can. There's an example of a halacha that has changed. Okay, our understanding of certain things changes. So in the early years, certain people permitted microphones because they thought nothing happens. There's no electricity. And then somebody said, well, do you know how it works? The current changes according to your voice. So then, of course, it was a problem. Sorry, Mark. Was that what you were going to ask about organ donation?
Well, I was going to ask a bit about that. I just wanted to know. I read in the Jewish news that this lady's very confused over, when a person dies, can the organs be donated?
So I think the current advice, as I understand it, is this is what Ari Jesner said in last week's Jewish News, that you can sign up for the NHS register and you can opt in provided you stipulate that you want your religious beliefs to be respected, which means in practice that God forbid if anything happens to you, the transplant coordinators should speak to your family rabbi. Now here's the problem which I haven't seen a solution to. You need a 24-hour helpline for that. Because the scenario is somebody's died suddenly and there's a very small window of time to transplant their organs. And if you're going to require rabbinic approval, you're going to need someone you can get hold of immediately. So I was told that the Office of the Chief Rabbi was working on a helpline for organ donation. But I haven't seen anything further on it. There seems to be, I think what's happened is they thought the law was going to be delayed because of coronavirus, but in reality, the law has changed. Now, somebody approached me a while ago and said, she said, I'm not religious. She said, when I die, I want to be buried with all the Jewish traditions, very important to me. She said, I think she'd been a recipient. No, she hadn't. A family member had received a transplant organ. She felt very strongly she should give back, and she wanted to become an organ donor. And what should she do? And I said, look, I'll be very honest with you. I said, right now, this is going back a couple of years. If you sign up as an organ donor, there's then no room for religious considerations, whatever they may be. I said, I said, you could sign up as a donor and your kids might refuse anyway. So I said, what I suggest you morally is that if you genuinely want to give back, tell your children and tell your next of kin that if anything happens to you, you would like to be an organ donor, provided that it doesn't conflict with Jewish law. Tell them that. And that way, if anything happens to you, your children will know to say to the doctors, listen, it was his wish, ... her wish, ... And that's what we did. So I'm not sure that isn't the best advice now, is to basically say, look, I would like to donate if it's not in conflict with halakha, whatever that means. I'll give you an example, definition of death. According to halakha, you're not supposed to take, most people say you're not supposed to take organs from someone whose heart is still beating. That's a whole debate. That's a whole 1 hour share in itself. But the Chief Rabbi's office is saying you can opt in on the basis that your religious preferences will be respected, meaning a Rav will be consulted if anything happens to you. How that Rav gets consulted, to me, is not entirely clear. There are some harrowing stories of people who somebody was on their deathbed, right? I know somebody. I once had Rabbi Pink, who spoke recently here, came to speak for us in Cardiff about autonomy, and he spoke about end of life. People don't realize there's a lot of halakhas around end of life issues. You can't just turn off machines. It's not so simple. So people say, oh, Rabbi, we've told them we don't want to hurt stuff anymore. That's right, isn't it? They'll turn off the machines if anything happens. It's not quite as simple as that. But anyway, and he gave a talk. And two people came up to me after the talk. One came up to me, was a very traditional Jew, very strong, not from, but very traditional, came up to me afterwards and said, my brother was in a vegetative state. He said, and it's funny, he says, we agreed to turn off the machines. It was like 40 years earlier. I don't know exact details, but he said, it never occurred to us to find out what the halakhic view would have been. He says, actually, it's bothered me over the years that I should have found out what the halakhic view was, and I didn't. The other person that came up to me was in tears and said that her brother had been very ill and they had to make a decision. And this is in the days for mobile phones, and they couldn't get hold of the Rav, and she was devastated by that. So the comment I would make is you have to, certainly 6 days a week, you can get hold of me. I try to listen to messages or answer if I think it's urgent. It's hard, obviously, but I know I don't always answer my phone if you've tried calling me, but I always pick up the message. And if it's urgent, I would always deal with it. And I have access to people that can advise. And I talk about it from time to time in shul. I feel very strongly that no matter how religious or not you are, when you're dealing with monumental things like end-of-life issues, you don't want to have to feel guilty afterwards that you wonder if you did the right thing. So by consulting and getting the halachic view, at least you know what Judaism tells you. You might decide not to follow it. Obviously, some people do. But at least you don't have to wonder for years afterwards. For a lot of people, it's quite comforting to know that their tradition would endorse what they're doing. But at the moment, as I understand, that's what the Chief Rabbi is saying. You can opt in with a religious provision, which says, I'm an Orthodox Jew. Please make sure that my rabbi is consulted. But like I said, the rabbi has to be available in an emergency.
But it's still not clear, is it, though? It's not
I don't
clear.
know. What's your question?
My question, I want to get back to the consensus of things.
Right.
I was just thinking Israel does 1 day and the rest of the world does 2 days. So there hasn't been a consensus.
No, but the 2 days was never instituted for Israel. So, I mean, I suppose the interesting question you could raise is, I don't know if this is a fair point, but we often find that in halacha, we try to be uniform with things, right? So why do we keep 3 hours or 6 hours or 1 hour after chicken when it's not meat? Because we want to have a uniformity so people don't get confused, right? Why do we keep 2 days Shavuot when we know it's 49 days after Pesach? To avoid confusion. So you could turn around and say, I understand in times of the shtetl that in the land of Israel kept 1 day, everyone else kept 2 days, and never the twain shall meet. Nowadays, it's quite common to have people say, Rabbi, what should I do? I'm going to Israel. How many days do I have to keep? Right? I'm sure that the Bendans and the Rainsburys will have come across this question. Yeah. And you can't get a consensus. I just tell you, in Chabad alone, I know of at least 2 Rabbonim in Israel who give completely different views on this, whether you should keep 2 days or 1 day if you're a visitor. So the case you could make is that there's already a lack of clarity. I don't know. It's an interesting one. I don't think it's going to get solved in our lifetime. It doesn't bother me personally. If anything, I have to work harder because of 2 days Yom Tov. But I can see where people are coming from. That's the classic example. What are other examples? Look, every new technology that comes along, there are some cultures like the Amish culture, for example, that they shun electricity and things, that they live like they did 200 years ago. We don't do that. We use technology. We use medical technology. We use science, right? We use digital technology, right? Some communities don't. It's interesting. Certain schools made a, if you like, ideological decision not to go online because they don't believe you should be using the internet. Those schools have found it very hard. Pardes and like Torah Tamima and schools, they're good schools. They found it very hard without having Zoom or whatever, but that's a decision they made. But besides for that, we do use technology. Nobody says, oh, you shouldn't use technology because it wasn't around in the times of the Bible, right? We do use technology. Sure. Okay.
Rabbi,
so, yeah.
Rab, did you see Lisa's question?
No, sorry. What was the question? Oh, one sec. Sorry, Lisa.
She's just put something on the chat.
Right. Okay. Good question. Right. Let's try to give a very quick overview of written and oral Torah. Right. Now, I obviously can't speak for Reform, but I have a feeling about certain things that I think that the non-Orthodox. So first of all, you've got what's written in the Torah. I'll give you a simple example. It says in the Torah you can't light a fire on Shabbat. Right? Absolutely clear. I'm not sure how you can argue with that. Well, I know how people argue with that, right? But whatever kind of a Jew you are, the Torah says quite clearly you can't light a fire on Shabbat. The Torah says you have to keep Shabbat. It doesn't tell you exactly how. So in Orthodox Jews, we learn from the 39 categories of work that were done in the Mishkan. Or we learn, so I think in Orthodoxy there's a few issues. There's obviously the absolute clearly laid down biblical commandments. Don't light a fire on Shabbat. Don't carry things from one place to another on Shabbat. That's written in the Torah, right? Don't eat pork, right? Don't eat bugs in vegetables. It's laid down clearly in the Torah. You can't eat creepy crawlies, so you have to check your vegetables, right? Not stealing, etc. Right? Okay. Now, can I use my mobile phone on Shabbat? That becomes a matter of rabbinic law. How does my phone work? How does electricity work? What paradigm does it fit into? That becomes a matter of rabbinic law. Can I drive my car on Shabbat? Becomes a matter of rabbinic law. Although it's not a matter of rabbinic law, because it's probably a matter of Torah law, because when you start the engine, you are lighting a fire, right? Maybe not as much as in the old days. So there's the Torah law, and then there's the rabbinic law. So the Torah law says you can't eat pork or bacon. The rabbinic law says you can't even have something that's been cooked on the same dishes, right? Or something like that. The Torah says you can't cook a kid in its mother's milk. That's the mitzvah. One of the 613 is not to eat milk and meat together, cook them together. And the rabbis come along and give us a set of rules around that. Now, Orthodox and Reform, you're going to find, I think, several things. You're going to find a fundamental difference on rabbinic law. So you might have Reform congregations where they say, we won't eat pork because the Torah says explicitly not to eat pork. But the Torah doesn't and the Torah says not to eat blood. And you know what? All meat gets washed, so we don't believe you have to have shechita. You can buy, it might be a view that say you can buy chicken, regular chicken, as long as you wash it carefully to get rid of the blood. I know, for example, right? Where I would say I'm a bit lost is that you get people saying things like, well, lighting a fire is work because rubbing two sticks together is hard work, but nowadays it's easy to light a fire. So I don't understand. The Torah tells you quite clearly you cannot light a flame on Shabbat. How do you get around that without saying the Torah doesn't apply? Right, which, by the way, is what Christianity did. Christianity came along and said, the law doesn't apply anymore. Yoshka fulfilled the law, blah, 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 blah. So when you get
blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, basically. So when you get letters like this, which I received this week from a missionary telling me why I should believe in Yoshka as a Jew, a guy called Robert Weissman, who I suspect is Jewish. I wrote him quite a nasty email saying that I was highly offended that he's trying to get me to change my religion. they're starting to say you can be Jewish and still believe in Christianity because you keep all the mitzvot still. But that's not what Yoshka said. He said you don't have to keep the law anymore. So in Judaism, we do have to keep the law. It's what we just spoken a whole shir about, right? And by the way, yeah, we're all sinners. That's fine. We make mistakes. We pick ourselves up and we try to learn from our mistakes. Right? In Christianity, it says, you're a sinner and the only cure is to believe in the cross and whatever. In Judaism, we say, no, we have Yom Kippur, we have Teshuvah. That's fine. We all make mistakes. But we fundamentally believe we have to follow the law. If you're Orthodox, you have to follow the rabbinic laws as well, as interpreted in every generation. So in our current generation, that would apply to things like electricity or medical technology, right? If you're a Reformed Jew, then you'll say you don't have to follow the rabbinic laws. Whether you have to follow the Torah laws, I can't speak for Reform. As I said, to me, it's a bit illogical that no matter how liberal you are, you wouldn't follow whatever's written explicitly in the Torah. But I'm not a Reform rabbi, so I can't comment. I can tell you that in America, perhaps more so than Britain, you have a very wide spectrum of clergy in non-Orthodox streams. So, for example, it's quite common to have an Orthodox shul where one of the people that davens there in the mornings is the conservative rabbi, because he, usually, or possibly she, is more religious than their congregants, right? Not so much with the Reform rabbis, but certainly the conservative rabbis in America. A lot of them are quite observant, but their congregants aren't. So it's not so straightforward. The mitzvah means a commandment, so anything in the Torah which we're explicitly told to do this or do not do that, is one of the 613 mitzvot. By the way, if you go through the Torah and try to count them, you might get stuck, because different people count them different ways, right? But it's do not cook in the mother's milk is a mitzvah. Right, keeping Shabbat is an explicit mitzvah. Right, not eating treif meat is a negative commandment. Right, not being cruel to animals is a negative commandment. Being honest is a positive commandment. Not bad mouthing people or spreading rumors is a negative commandment. We could go through all 613. By the way, the vast majority are concerned with animal sacrifices, and we can't do them nowadays. Huge number of mitzvot. The one mitzvah that we're all obsessed with, which has hit us the most the last few months, which is what? Davening with a minion. Right? As far as I know, there is only one mitzvah in the Torah that speaks about davening. It says that there is a positive mitzvah, I believe, to petition God, to pray to God. It's one of 613. And yet our whole life revolves around shul and davening and minyan. And it's only one mitzvah. I mean, it's a very important one, prayer, connecting to God. But it's funny. So I can't speak for Reform, but my understanding is the first difference you're going to find between Orthodoxy and non-Orthodoxy is rabbinic law. And the second difference would be possibly even Torah law. And the third difference would be the approach to the law. So, for example, yes, we all know people park around the corner. Right? When I was in Cardiff, somebody once came up to me. She said, I live on Kincoid Road, which is up from the shul. She says, I'm a member of the Reform shul. She says, people from your congregation park outside my house on Shabbat and they are inconsiderate. Why can't you open your car park? We all know they drive, to which I said they do. Why can't you open your car park? So I said, to number one, I apologize if anyone's being inconsiderate. There's no justification for that. I said, I will give you a simple analogy, and to me it made sense. I said, you have no smoking in many buildings. I said, you get people who smoke outside. I said, does that mean we should say, well, they're going to smoke anyway, they may as well smoke in the building? No, you say, our premises are a smoke-free building. I said, our synagogue is a Shabbat observant building. I said, of course, we don't know what people do when they leave. It may well be that they don't keep Shabbat. They probably don't keep kosher either. But inside we keep kosher. So I said, I'm sorry for your personal frustration. I totally understand it. I said, and we will, in our next email, say that when parking for shul events, please park considerately, because people come during the week as well. I said, but ultimately, opening our car park would be an abandonment of our principles, that you don't drive on Shabbat, and that our premises are a Shabbat observant premises. And whereas Reform would say, presumably, we'll open the car park. What's wrong with that? Right? This is the 21st century. You can drive on Shabbat. So the Orthodox Jews are the ones that walk on Yom Kippur, and the Reform ones say, why should I walk? I think that, maybe I'm being unfair. I don't know. That's my understanding. And interestingly, we once had a program from an outreach organization that came to our shul in Cardiff that was very laid back. It was basically a load of completely non-religious kids who came with their madrachim, and it was a Shabbaton. They were very laid back. They were so laid back that one of the kids, they joined us for Shabbos for meals in the shul and for the service. And one of the participants was smoking in the car park of the shul. And I said to one of the madrachim, I'm sorry, but that's really not appropriate. He's like, well, he's not religious. And I said, I'm sorry, but you don't smoke when you're in shul on Shabbat. And they had to go and tell them. And it was an interesting discussion. The Madrich was actually religious. But their attitude was, we're not pushing them and we're not this. I said, that's fine. I said, but you can have a standard. It was a very interesting conversation.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Did you see my mum's comment?
It's not okay.
Right. So the truth is, I don't know. It's above my pay grade because I honestly don't know. But the Agunah is a really good example where consensus is essential, right? Because what's the problem with right? For those who didn't see the question was, fine. We understand we need a consensus of rabbinic opinion. Why can't the rabbis get together to solve the Agunah problem? Right? So the answer to that is, the cynical answer is because the rabbis can't get together because you always have arguments. The real answer is probably because of what's at stake from all sides. If you go around saying people, right, one of the highest institutions in Judaism is marriage, right? To break one's marriage vows is I mean, it used to be a cardinal sin in Talmudic times, temple times, right? But it's a serious business. So one of the classic problems, which is really tragic, is somebody who's got a civil divorce and not had a Jewish divorce. They remain halachically married, and then they go off and marry someone else civilly. But the thing is, they're still married to their first partner, right? And there's a problem there, right? If they have children, those children are officially mamzerim. They're illegitimate because they can't get married because they're still married. I have a friend who is now on his second marriage, has 3 wonderful children who've all grown up, who are all, as it happens, living Orthodox religious lives. He grew up in Reform. He got married, didn't work out. He got divorced. His Reform rabbi said to him, we'll call him Yankel. He's not Yankel, whatever, Rebbe Yid. He said, I don't believe in it. He said, but for your own sake, in case you ever want to get married in Orthodox shul, go to another base and get a get, right? Which was a very decent thing to do. And then he was able to remarry second time in Orthodox shul with no issues and no complications and so on. That was a very honest Reform rabbi, right? But you have to be very honest to say, you should actually go to Orthodox for this, even though I don't really hold from it, but for your own sake, to cover your bases. So any rabbinic decision around agunot, to nullify marriages or to release people from marriages without a divorce document, is going to effectively say to people, you're not married to your husband or your wife anymore. You are free to go and marry and consort with others. And if that's not correct, that would be a grave violation of basic family values in Judaism. So you have to get it right. I'll give you an interesting example. Most of you, when you got married on your ketubah, right, you wrote your Hebrew name, correct? How many people here, hands up, are known by their Hebrew name? Right. So why on the ketubah does it say your Hebrew name? So interestingly, in Israel, actually, I'm interested to know, for example, what they put on Michael's, because obviously he's known as Michael, but he's Meir David. So I would be very interested to know what they put on his, actually. Maybe we'll ask him. But in Israel, they actually, I think they put, if you're known by your English name, they put your English name, because that's the name you're known by. Regardless, on a get, they will put every name you are known by. Okay? So if your name is Yosef, you're known as Joe or Joey or Joe Boy, they will put all of that on the get. Why? Because a get releases someone from the halachic Torah institution of marriage to go marry someone else, which is a really big deal. We want to make sure we get it right. There's no mistakes. A get is extremely carefully written because to release someone from marriage is a huge deal. So a get is written very, very carefully. So all the names a person is known by, so there can be no confusion. They can't claim later on that it was false or anything like that, which gives rise to a very interesting situation. That there was a case of a gentleman who had changed gender, and on the get, it said John, now known as Jeanette. Okay? Because that's what they're known as. Right? If you're Prince and you're now known, is he still around? You're now known as a symbol, that's what your get would say. Because it's so important to get it right, pardon the pun. So when you're dealing with matters of status, conversion, and marriage, you don't want to get it wrong. You don't want to mess up people's lives. So any agonah solution would have to have consensus. Otherwise, it just wouldn't work. And probably, ironically, lack of consensus stems from the fact that it's such huge stakes, if you like. Hindquarter meat. Anyone like hindquarter meat here? Rump steak? You can't get it over here, right? I don't. I've never tried it. In Israel, you can get it. In Argentina, you can get it. You can't get it over here. Why? Because it's very hard to pull out the veins from the sciatic nerve to make it kosher. So in Europe, they simply banned it. It's called tribering for those who speak Yiddish. Triber is the verb to porge, take out the veins, right? So if you recall, there was once a restaurant that opened up that was serving it according to some, and most Bate Din don't accept it. There's an example, but that doesn't affect people's lives in the same way. So sometimes they call each other by their Hebrew names. So it's interesting. As I said, in Israel, on a ketubah, they'll put the name you're usually known by, I believe. So if you use your English name, they'll put that. But on a get, they would put any name you're known by in any variation and any spelling to make sure it's absolutely right. Look, it's the same thing when you fill in forms now. They say, are you known by any other name? Right? It's important. It's a big topic, rabbinic consensus, but it's very hard. I'll just give you a simple local example. I think I'll name the name because he's not there anymore. At some point in time, please God, it will happen again. In our shul, the decision was made that there was no reason on earth why when the Sefer Torah goes around the shul, it shouldn't go to the ladies section as well for them to kiss the Sefer Torah, right? It doesn't go into the ladies section. They come to the front of the ladies section. It's hardly controversial. Some people would say it's still, it's hardly earth-shattering and groundbreaking. But believe it or not, there are shuls where they don't do that. They regard that as very radical. So when we started doing that, I had a text from Rabbi Hyman at the time saying, what's going on in your shul? Who allowed this? What's going on? Now they want to do it in my shul as well. What's going on? And my first response was, number one, there's nothing wrong with it. And I thought, I'll just check. I phoned up Dan Galley, said there's nothing wrong with it. I said, and number two, you have to explain to people in your shul that you are the authority in your shul and you are the Rav. And, just because someone up the road does something doesn't mean everyone should be doing it. Do we surely believe in autonomy? Somebody says, how come in JCOS they don't do this, in JFS they do? Okay, well, go to JFS then, If it bothers you that much, use your choice. But it's a bit unfair to come to a community of rabbi and say that because they do this in that shul, they should do this in our shul, right? There's certain independence. So it's very hard to get consensus. And it's not always good to have consensus, because sometimes consensus means that you're constricted. You can't do anything you want to do, right? And we want to have individual halachic independence to an extent. Anyway, look, it's like many things. It's easy to discuss it until you're the person undergoing it, the person going through it. If a person was an Agunah and we're having this discussion, they would probably say, I don't care what you say, it doesn't help my life. All the explanations in the world don't help my life, and I get that. Okay, I get that. Same with end-of-life issues we were talking about. There's a big difference between the theoretical discussion and the person who's faced with agonizing decisions to make. But, it's we're talking theoretically. Yeah.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Do you think there'll be any questions from the viewers viewing it on Facebook?
I never get any questions from them. I don't really watch it. That's the truth. I can't. There's only so many different places
He might go.
I can be at once. If anyone's been on Facebook, if you want to send a question, put it in the chat. I'll try to answer it later. I can't even see it at the moment. If I go to Facebook, my computer's going to freeze. Okay, let's switch this off.
This has been going for nearly an hour.
Young Mr. Taylor.
Yeah.
If I was on TV, right, and I was broadcasting, would I be doing all the tech stuff, or would I have a technician to do it for me?
You'd have a technician.
Right, okay. So now all us rabbis have become broadcasters. So we sit in front of our computers with all our gear. We sit in shul with all our gear. And the truth is, I've got to tell you, it doesn't work to do both. So when we did Yom HaShoah, I was doing both. It was very difficult. When we did my son's bar mitzvah, my wife did the tech, basically. The other day, Ethel did some of the tech for somebody. But because I'm doing it all myself, sitting here trying to read the chat and trying to read my papers, I don't think I can do Facebook as well. It's just too much. So sorry if you watch on Facebook. But next time, you're welcome to join us on Zoom. It's free for all. Okay.
Yeah.
I think we've all become IT experts.
Yes.
I have especially.
It's also the modern day version of you walk into a shop and you're about to be served and the phone rings and they pick it up, and you get frustrated. But then when you're the person on the phone, you get frustrated, they don't answer. So it's frustrating for people on Zoom if you're constantly checking Facebook. It's frustrating for the people in shul if you're constantly on Zoom. But then it's frustrating for people on Zoom that they're not there in person as well. So I guess we're all getting frustrated, basically. What can you do? Right, I think we're going to sign off there. the nice
Yes, but
lots of yes.
Can I ask about next Shabbos? So what's
Right,
happening?
we are open. We are open this Shabbos. We're very excited. We've been open during the week, but it's a different kind of a obviously scenario. We are open for Shabbos. It would be very helpful if you can let the office or myself know if you are coming, so we can just make sure we have enough chairs. But it's not going to be fixed seats. You will have access to your locker. You'll be asked to go one at a time into the locker room. Anyone is welcome. If you're under 12, please speak to me privately. That's a separate discussion. Because the advice now, excuse me, is that children are discretionary. But I think the concern is that most under 12s, and I include most of mine in this, do not understand social distancing or not touching things, and therefore a bit of a liability at the moment. So that's, I think, certainly our first week. My kids are not going to be there. My older kids will be there. We're starting at 10. We'll probably have Tanya at 9:30. I think that's the plan. We're trying to work out details of how to make coffee and tea. We are starting at 10, and we'll probably finish by about 11:30, 45. No kiddish, sorry. If you're desperate, we've got water bottles, which you can have a drink. And it's going to be interesting. Please bring a mask, wear a mask, and please join us if you're not feeling ill, basically. So it should be quite exciting. And we can't even sing Matovu properly because we're not singing. And also no one's there for Matovu. Anyway. Because that's the big shul opening, you know. Matovu, yeah. Mark, yeah.
Yeah, so can you put my name down then, please?
Yes, certainly.
And me. And me, Rabbi.
And us, Rabbi.
We'll be there. We'll be there.
Why is there no singing if everyone's wearing masks?
This is the $64,000 question. I just bumped into a guy who is the rector of the local Baptist church, and he introduced himself to me. I had a nice chat. It's funny. He says, I think I saw your wife on the bus once. I helped her with her stroller, and she doesn't take the bus very often. I asked me if she said, there was a man once. So he didn't introduce himself, a guy with a beard. I said, yeah, that's him. So he must have worked out that she must be the Rebbitzin. Anyway, so he said they find it really difficult, no singing. So the church is not doing it either. I understand the theory. The theory is, look, if you ever watch a real opera singing, there's a lot of, they spray basically. So the theory is that you produce more drops. I don't know, but that's what we've been told. We have to find a balance between having a nice experience in shul of davening and everyone feeling safe and being safe. And it's going to be a work in progress. I've been to 2 shuls the past 2 weeks. I went to Leytonstone 2 weeks ago, went to Buckerstill last week. The truth is I quite enjoyed it. I quite fancy a different shul every week, but it's not viable from this week. Both places did some singing. They did some singing. Whether they should or shouldn't have, I can't comment. They did some singing, but not really. Friday night, we're going to have outside on our patio. What I'm planning to do is to suggest that people might still want to wear masks. It doesn't do any harm. And that if people want to sing, we've got a big garden. They can go wander in the garden. And
Isn't that on Friday? Isn't that on Friday week, Rabbi?
No, we're going to start this Friday night. Starting this Friday night.
So is it only Shabbos afternoon that's delayed?
Shabbos afternoon, we're not going to do this week. We have to work out logistics. Yes. So this week, sorry, this is got changed. Originally, we were going to start Friday night next week. We've decided to try it outside. So Friday night this week on our patio, 7 o'clock, and then we'll go to 7:15 next week, I think. And Shabbat day, 10 o'clock in shul, and no Shabbos mincha this week.
So it's going to be a Kabbalah service.
So, and we're going to do live stream as well. So here's the problem.
Oh,
yeah, on Friday night, on not Shabbos day. So here's the problem. People have got used to singing. Some people are very nervous. I know there are people in this chat who are nervous about their health, and I understand that. So I'm thinking of saying to people that, number one, we're learning, it's new. So anything you're not comfortable with, you have to tell us afterwards. We're trying to change it. But number two, for Friday night, we've got our whole garden. We're going to set out chairs at least 2 meters apart on the patio. Haven't we figured out if we need a mechitza yet? That's an interesting question. And I'll say to people, if you want to sing, I suggest you go stand in the garden. There's plenty of space. We'll put some chairs out, and then you're miles away from anyone else, and then no one has to worry. But it'll be a work in progress. We'll see. Shabbos morning is going to be strange. You can sing to yourself quietly. So one shul evidently they told people to hum and clap, and it works quite nicely. Humming is okay, apparently. But the government guidance is very strongly against singing. Go figure, even with a mask. So that's what we're doing. We're being careful.
So 7 o'clock Friday night.
7 o'clock Friday night, we'll say. Actually, we can. Do you know what? We can stick to 7 o'clock. It's getting earlier. We've missed the peak of summer. I think we can probably stick to 7 o'clock. It's mid-June. Yeah, because the earliest Shabbat is 7:30. I think we can stick to 7 o'clock, actually. Julian, the problem is because we've not been insured, I've not even thought about the times at all for months.
It's
So we'll have to look at
mid-September
time.
for it's 7:15.
Do we normally say 7:15 until mid-September?
Until it crosses over.
Okay, so should we go for 7:15?
Yeah.
Okay, so 7:15. And we will live stream until Shabbat comes in.
Rabbi,
Yes.
can you put that all on the group, please?
Yeah, I will in due course, don't worry.
Okay.
Yes. Well, not quite as much as I just said, but yeah. So, yeah, so if you're planning to come, you know, we'll see this week should be interesting. Chigwell had a 1-minute sermon last week. I wasn't there, but apparently that was quite popular.
What, Lynn, in your sermon?
I don't know. Right, I'll just send Lynn this list actually right now while I remember who's coming. Okay, right. So if that's it for today, I think we'll sign off. It's been quite lively. Thank you everyone for your contributions.
We've been here for 1 hour and 24 minutes exact.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
No cooking this afternoon, is there?
Bye.
No, not to next week.
No, not till next
We
week.
had it last week.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
Okay. Bye.